I knew exactly where they were in the room. I recalled the whole conversation to them, and I also could picture them, but which is strange because I was on a life support machine. There was a moment where I wasn't there anymore inside my own body, and I could see these two small little boys that were like ushering me out of the room. And then I did see what I would describe as a funeral, and I was at the back of the room, and that's where I felt the most energy I've ever felt in my entire life, and the most powerful.
Hello, Kirsty Salisbury here, and welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. If you're enjoying this content, can you please like, subscribe, maybe you want to share it around. I don't say this very often. In fact, I can't remember a time I've ever said this, but I received an email in the middle of the night from a listener, and he said, I loved the conversation that you had. I don't know if you've done any other episodes. And I thought, hang on a minute. There are literally hundreds of recordings of content out there. So if you want to stay up to date, please just do that. That's me. I don't try and promote a whole lot. I like to get straight into the stories, as you know. Now, to get into today's episode, I'm really excited. We have got Charlie Webster joining us. Charlie had a near-death experience after contracting malaria. She was given 24 hours to live, and her experience took place while she was on life support. She felt very much alive during this time. She was aware of the doctors working on her, and as you can imagine, it's changed everything for her. Charlie has a background in journalism and as a TV presenter, and she just recently started her own podcast, which is called Died and Survived, so you may want to check that out. So Charlie, welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. It's fabulous to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you.
You were given 24 hours to live quite some time ago. How did this all sort of unfold?
You know, it's interesting that you say quite some time ago, because for anybody listening that maybe has experienced anything like I have, and I know yourself, you have a background which has inspired you to do this podcast, but for me, it doesn't feel like a long time ago at all. It was 6 years ago, which for anybody that's experienced trauma, it's not something that just disappears. It's something that lives quite present in ourselves. And I really don't believe that it ever disappears, which is okay. It's more about accepting what you've experienced, and that's a part of you, and to embrace that. So I just wanted to make sure that's important for me to say that, because it's still a very big part of my life, because I mean, I nearly died. And initially when I came out of hospital, I did question myself a lot about why I survived and maybe other people don't. And it messed with my head a little bit, and I had all these questions. But yes, I was given 24 hours to live. It's such a long story, so I'll try and give a very quick brief of it. For those that don't know, I did a cycle challenge from London, England. I'm from England originally, even though I'm currently sat somewhere in Los Angeles in California. So this is definitely an international conversation. And I cycled 3,000 miles to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Really long way.
Yes, that's the story for another podcast. Honestly, I could spend ages being like, oh my God. And then I nearly fell asleep on the bike, even though I was cycling so fast, and I was so dehydrated and I couldn't go to the toilet, and we slept 2 hours. And by the end,
oh my goodness.
I'm sorry. But I was raising money for charity for underprivileged children from the area that I'm from. But yeah, it was very difficult. And then because of what happened to me, it kind of overshadowed the achievement. It's actually, I don't often quite talk about this, but for a long time, I couldn't even talk about the actual challenge that I did, or even look at photos of the challenge, because it was so overshadowed by what happened for me. And it was so to me, and it was so triggering. But I did the cycle ride. I didn't have a crash, or nothing happened to me on the way. I arrived in Rio, got to the top of Christ Redeemer. And you mentioned my podcast, Died and Survived. It's slightly different from yours, because it's just more about, I did it more as a documentary style, that took you from the beginning of my journey to then ask a lot of questions, to reflect on maybe how we can learn from near-death experiences or people's trauma to help people live their life now. So I arrived in Rio. There's a little video of me at Christ Redeemer at the top being like, yeah, wow, done this challenge. So glad I made it. And then 24 hours later, I was critically ill. 24 hours after that, I was told I was dying. And then probably 12 hours after that, I was struggling to breathe, hooked up to machines in an intensive care ward, and my mum was flown out to say goodbye to me. And that's how quick it happened. As you said, they didn't realize at the time. This was after the fact. They found out that I had malaria, but I also had 3 other diseases too that are hard to pronounce. And so it was a lot of complications. And then I was induced in a coma because I was dying. So they had to induce me in a coma because I had multiple organ failure to try and keep me alive. And when I was in the coma, I remember a lot. I could hear. It was, for me, very distressing. I battled with that quite a lot afterwards because I felt like I had a very distressing experience. And then when I hear people talk about near-death experiences, it seems to be just a lot more peaceful than mine. But then I talk about this in my podcast. I have met quite a few people and specialists that have looked into near-death experiences. And what I realized was that even though it was distressing, it was me fighting because I so desperately wanted to live. It wasn't that my near-death experience was necessarily distressing. It was what I was going through that I found so distressing. And then I survived, but doctors didn't think I would survive. And they thought if I did come out and survive, because I was resuscitated, then I would be disabled or brain damaged in some way because they saw hemorrhaging in my brain. So it was all a bit, oh my gosh, there's no chance she's going to survive. Oh my gosh, she's survived. How is that even possible? Which, I'm so grateful that I'm here, but also that, like I said, at the beginning, it can be a bit confusing. I felt confused about what happened to me. There was a lot of trauma afterwards. Mentally, I had to learn how to walk again, and come to terms with this new me and what had happened to me, and those big questions of, well, why did I survive it when on paper it's near impossible?
You talked about how when you were in the coma, you were unconscious, you were aware of the doctors working on you, and that you felt alive. Are you able to go into any more detail around that time?
Yeah. So it's always, whenever I talk about this, I have these such vivid pictures in my head, and I almost wish I could. I'm going to try and explain them, but I wish you could be in my head for a moment, or everyone listening could be, because I see it so clearly even now. And that's it. It's not like a memory. It obviously is a memory, but it's not. It's something that is, I could be there right now. It's so clear in my head how I was feeling and what was going on. I do remember, sensing my mum, and I told them stories that I heard them talk about. That my mum and brother once were arguing when I was in the coma, and I knew exactly where they were in the room. I recalled the whole conversation to them, and I also could picture them, which is strange because I was on a life support machine and I had my eyes closed, and even though I was feeling very mentally alive, I was physically not. So that I always find that quite interesting how I know that. And I could hear doctors talking about me, and I also experienced what I feel like was death. And I was resuscitated, and nobody's ever going to know whether this was the moment where I was resuscitated or not. But I feel like there was a moment where I wasn't there anymore inside my own body, and I could see these 2 small little boys that were like ushering me out of the room, and I was at the other side of the room where the door is, and then there was this mass, this thing talking to me, and telling me that I had to leave. And then I had a conversation with this mass. And initially it was just very nonchalant. It was like, oh, you're okay. You're going to get some milk and you're going to the park. Like that kind of conversation where it's just not about anything. And then I, for a second, just wanted to just go with this thing. And that was that, because I think I just felt so exhausted from fighting that moment. But also I felt like I've been through a lot in my life, and just sometimes you just feel exhausted, right? And I think in that moment I was in pain, I was scared, I knew that I was in a coma, and I knew that I wasn't okay. Because it's not like, I've never experienced an accident, but it was progressive. Like I was told I was going to die, and then I was there when they then eventually, when I couldn't breathe, and they were put in a tube, and I even remember them intubating me. And I'm not supposed to remember that exactly. Like I've spoke to people afterwards and doctors, and they're like, you're not supposed to remember that. And I recalled to them that moment, which I couldn't have recalled otherwise. Like I've never even been in a hospital before. I think I've been in a hospital once in my entire life, apart from obviously when I was born. So it's not like I'm familiar with those kind of things or terms. So I feel like I was aware so much of the time. And I do remember, I'm going like a tangent, but it just came into my head. I do remember this woman who turns out to be one of the consultants, and I couldn't see her. Again, I emphasize I was in a coma, eyes closed, tube breathing for me, tape across my face. If you looked at me, you'd think I was not there anymore, and physically I wasn't. But I knew she was standing over me. I could sense it. And she was saying to me, you're really not very well. I can't remember. She was basically saying these things to me, and all I remember inside was being like, I know, I'm fuck, I can feel it. I know. But obviously I couldn't communicate. And the fact that my brain was just going so fast, but then it wasn't, but sometimes they didn't register brain activity in my brain. Yet I feel all these things and remember all these things, and there's all these crazy moments about it. But going back to this conversation I feel like I had with death, in that moment, I did want to go for a split second, because I'd had enough. But it only lasted for a second, and well, I have no concept of time, but I felt like it only lasted a split second. And then I ended up having what I felt like was a justification of why I wanted to stay. And I just, in that moment, felt the most powerful I've ever felt, which is also very contradictory because none of my organs were working at the time.
Yeah.
I know. And I so desperately wanted to live, and nothing could beat me in that moment. That's what it felt like. It felt like the most powerful energy that if I could capture it now, oh my gosh, who knows what I could do.
Yeah.
Because I was like, no, I'm not going anywhere. Like, what about my mom? What about my brothers? Like, I'm very close to my mom and brothers. I've still got things I want to do in my life. At the time, I just turned 40, and at the time I was 34. Yeah, 34 or 33, about to turn 34. And I was like, I'm not finished yet. I've not finished with my life. What was the point of me being here if I'm just going to die now? And I know that sounds like I'm making some dark, comedic, British, sarcastic joke in the way I'm describing it, but genuinely, that's what it felt like, and that's what happened. And then I did see what I would describe as a funeral, and I was at the back of the room, and I was looking at the back of people's heads, but I couldn't see anything, and I couldn't see faces. Even if I tried, I couldn't see faces. I could only see the back of people's heads. And I do remember my nan and granddad, who both passed away by then. And I remember being really upset with them because they wouldn't speak to me. But I'm very, very close. I was very close to my nan and granddad before they passed away. You know, I lived with them sometimes when I was a kid, and they looked after me a lot. And my granddad was a father figure to me. And then I saw my mum at the front of the funeral being just so heartbroken, like to the extreme where, you know, ripped her in pieces. And that caused me so much pain that I would have done anything to live so that she didn't suffer that heartbreak.
Oh, wow.
I know that seems
I
quite
know.
a lot.
No, it does. I'm just thinking of my own daughter and just, oh my goodness, yeah, the heartbreak, just how much we can love people and get so connected to them. The question I just want to jump in with is, was your mother still alive at the time that this was happening?
Oh yeah, she's
still
very
alive.
alive.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, because as you're talking about, often with near-death experiences, people experience past loved ones who come into the experience in some form. And very few people have loved ones that come in who are still alive. And I had this with my father, who was alive at the time. He came in. You can go back and listen to my own episode if you want to get that full story. But I was just thinking through that. You've seen your grandparents and they're not acknowledging you, and yet you get a glimpse of the grief of your own mother. And yeah, I just had to take a moment then, because I was just in that space of how much we can love people and what grief and loss really feels like.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, it was pain both ways. Like the pain of seeing my mum in pain gave me so much fight to survive, and it for me it became not a thing about myself. It became a thing about what my life I wanted my life to mean, or I want my life to mean, and the connection and responsibility I feel for the people I love and that love me. And I think, you know, one of the things I wanted to do with my podcast, Died and Survived, is talk about what you just mentioned around grief, because I think we don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about death and grief enough. And because I faced it like I did, I feel like I came face to face with death. And I don't feel like I did. I know I did. I mean, doctors have, it's not just what I feel or something spiritual. Like from a scientific medical point of view, I did come face to face with death as well. And it did make me think a lot about how we deal with grief and death and our lives. And it's something that I really wanted to explore, because I wonder if we can take more comfort from people's experiences rather than question them. Because does it really matter like what we all believe if we can just take something that can help us have faith and hope and continue that love we have for people if they're not here anymore, with the hope that they, you know, they have gone to a better place, or at least are in peace, whatever we believe. Does that really matter?
Yeah, exactly. I think there are some beautiful teachings that we can take from these experiences. And that's why I love how all of these experiences are so unique. They're similar, they've got similar elements. And if you look at the Grayson scale, for example, which in theory, you look at the Grayson scale and you go, tick, I had that, and that determines the near-death experience. But I think outside of that, there are things which are common, but they're so personable. They're so unique to the person going through the experience. And like you, seeing your mother like that, oh, it's just heartbreaking. Did you feel like you had a choice? At one point you said, yeah, I was quite ready to go with death. I was quite ready to leave. Then you saw your mother, and then you're going, I just want to, you know, take this feeling of life and what I could do if I had that feeling now. Was there a point where you felt like you had a choice, or did it kind of all unfold and you were in, I say the emotion, I don't quite know what the word would be, in the flow of what was taking place?
You know, while you're asking that question, I'm thinking hard about how to answer responsibly. I know what I feel, but I want to answer responsibly, because I feel, and I can only speak from my experience, that I did choose. However, I caveat that by saying I also feel that, I think, irrelevant of everybody's belief, personally to me, I feel like I was meant to survive and I'm meant to be here. I don't know whether it's because I'm younger, but I know a lot of people sadly pass away when they're younger. I feel like maybe it's a hard one because it's something I grapple with myself, because, and the reason why I'm hesitating is because I find this quite difficult to say, because I was brought up in a atheist background, and I don't want religion to come into this, because to me it's not about religion. But I do feel that maybe God saved me, but I didn't really have a relationship with God before, so I don't know. But I'm just saying things because I want to be as honest as I possibly can, talking to you and for your listeners. But at the same time, I'm really conscious that people lose loved ones young, and I don't want it to sound like, well, maybe they didn't want to stay, because that's not fair for me to say that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. In me saying I feel like I did choose doesn't mean that I don't know whether there's a choice. But I can also understand the reason why I say that is because there was a moment where I just had enough. I just had enough. And it wasn't just about that moment. It was about my life. Like, I feel from the moment I was born, I've had to fight hard to be where I am. And I've had a lot of adversity. And I think in that moment, everything culminated for me. I did have a lot of flashbacks around my past and things that I hadn't dealt with. And the one positive, you might ask this question down the line, so let's revisit it. But I just want to make sure I do say it, that the one positive of my experience, because I'm not like, oh yes, that was meant to happen to me. It was a way to show me blah, blah, because my God, it was traumatic. You've got to be authentic. It was traumatic to me. I don't wish that on anybody. And it was the worst experience, one of the worst experiences of my life. So you can try and take positives, but you should also accept. I think it's important to not ignore the trauma.
Absolutely.
So that's important to me. But at the same time, the one positive I can take is I did deal with a lot of stuff that I hadn't dealt with afterwards. And the reason why was because in those moments, my past flashed back in front of me. Not like my life flashed in front of me. My trauma, the traumatic moments in my past hit me in the face, like I was being ran over repeatedly or hit by something in my face. And so in that moment, I did just want to give up because I felt exhausted. And in that moment, I do feel like I could have just gone. I felt it. And again, I'm just answering your question from my perspective. I don't want this to trigger anybody if they've lost somebody. But then I desperately fought so hard to live. So I feel like I did choose in that moment that it showed me I had so much more to live for than the trauma that I had already suffered. And that's really powerful. And that's so powerful for me because I have suffered from mental health because of some of the things I've been through. And there is moments in my life where I've not wanted to live because of my own trauma and because of my mental health. So in that moment to feel so desperate to live and be here, it made me think a lot of things about my life and what I've been through, and making sure that I deal with things so that I can live an emotionally healthy life, and I can take my trauma with me, but not necessarily live in it every second of every day, which I think I could sometimes happen to me because I never dealt with some of the things. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but I want to make sure that I give context to it and I answer it responsibly, but also authentically from my own experience.
Yeah, great. And I know that our listeners and myself as well appreciate that, because we've touched on choice a little bit, and do we have the choice to come back? Some do, some don't. From all of the people that I've interviewed, I mean, we don't actually know for the ones that choose to go, but many, many of the people I've interviewed have said they either had a very clear choice, they could return, or like myself, no, there was no choice, it just sort of unfolded. So we can't assume that if people didn't come back, if people right at the brink of death and they died, that they chose to leave. It's just not like that. Well, I don't think it's that black and white, to be fair.
No, I don't. And also, there is the physical element of it as well. I mean, doctors were fighting around me, and if I hadn't have been on life support, then I wouldn't have survived just medically, because I needed a life support machine to keep me alive. So if I'd have been somewhere without that facility, then my own fight in the spiritual aspect, or whatever we want to call it, it's really hard, isn't it? Because I don't want to label things, because then they become smaller by putting a word on it, right? But,
exactly.
then I wouldn't have survived, and I'm grateful for the medical team. So I think that's important to put in. Some places in the world don't have medical facilities, and even though I was in Rio, and it was not easy because it wasn't my home country and people didn't speak English, but I'm still grateful for the doctors and the nurses that did everything they could to keep me alive. So, not for one second am I saying that it was just my own mental ability to say, no, I'm coming back to life. Yeah.
The last thing you were sharing with us was you were seeing this funeral. I assume it was your funeral because your mother was there and just heartbroken, your grandparents there. You were looking at the back. You could see the back of everyone. Were you aware of your body at this point? Were you still aware that you were in a hospital room, or had you gone to the place of the funeral? And then what happened after that? How did you end up back in your body and waking up?
No, that's a really good question, because that made me think, no, I actually wasn't in the room, in the hospital room. I was in what felt like my funeral, and it was very bright white. I just remember it being so bright white, and I can picture it now in my head, so clear. It's bizarre, really. And it wasn't like I was looking at my body at any point. I didn't turn around and look at my body. I just was not there. I was in a different place. I was in a place that was very sterile, very white, but brilliant white, like so bright. It was so bright, it kind of hit you. And that after that moment, it was all around my mum. So as we were talking about, it was that heartbreak that I felt, and I didn't just see it, like I felt it as if, when we talk about heartbreak, right, you can physically feel it. It's not just a feeling, they've got a physicality to it, right? It physically hurts. It can grab you a breath. And even in our daily life, sometimes when relationships or friendships end, you feel that physical pain as heartbreak. And that's what I felt in that moment. And I saw how distressed my mum was, and continually distressed, and it just got worse and worse. And then I was pulled away from that room and trying to reach my mum. And I remember seeing like a lot of red in that moment, like blood. And I kind of came back, and then I was like, no. And that's when I was like, no. And then came back to being with this mass in front of me, which at the time I don't know what it was, but at the time I thought it was death. And I remember when I came out of the coma, I said to my mum and brother that I saw death, because I felt that that's what that was. And I was like, no, I'm not going. And it just became this huge, powerful energy between me and this thing that was in front of me. And all I could think about was my mum, and that my mum's been through a lot in her life, and ultimately it would be me that would bring her the most pain, even though I've done nothing but try and protect her and love her. And that is just it was such a deep emotion to think that in that at that moment. And that's the last thing I remember.
Wow, it's heavy, isn't it? That emotion, that feeling. Yeah. The you call it the mass.
Yeah, I know it's
That's in
the
the
awful
room.
description, but I don't
Yeah,
know
no,
what
that's
to call
okay.
it.
There often aren't words to label the things that we experience. So, I mean, I've got a very visual imagination. Quite often it's a cartoon, but it's there. And I'm imagining you in the bed. I don't quite know why, the hospital bed with this mass beside you. Did it give you any feelings? Like, were you afraid of it? Did it bring reassurance? Was it loving? Was it positive or scary
Initially,
or
it was just nothing. It was just
nothing?
there was no emotion. Yeah, initially it was just like, well, no, I suppose there was an emotion because it wasn't threatening. So
Yeah.
initially it was just like having a very normal conversation that has no, it's not loaded, there's no feeling attached to it. It's
Right.
just blanket day-to-day average. That's what it felt like. That's the best way I can describe it. And I didn't fear it. I didn't really feel anything other than it was just normal conversation. And it was like, okay. Genuinely, that's it, there was just nothing really. It was just okay. So what I meant to, so I'm not meant to be here then anymore. Oh, okay. It was a bit like that. And then when I started to question it, that's when everything changed and it became, I don't know. I'm trying to think if I really feared it. But I knew that it wasn't what I wanted to do, and it still wasn't being horrible to me. I'm saying it as if it was this person, but I can't describe it any other way. It wasn't exactly being horrible to me, or it was just like, you come in with us, and that was it. And then the more I had experiences around how I was feeling at the moment, and the more I questioned it and pushed back, then that's when it became really powerful. And then it became like a opposition to me. It became a something that I was fighting. But I wouldn't necessarily say I was, oh my God, I'm so scared of it. Like, in such fear. It was more like, no, it was more that wanted to do something that I didn't want to do, and I was fighting against it. And then I became, the more it became larger and bigger and more all-consuming, but then so did I.
Wow, that's quite cool, isn't it?
Yeah. So did I, and that's where I felt the most energy I've ever felt in my entire life, and the most powerful. That in that moment I felt like nothing could stop me from fighting.
Do you feel like you brought some of that back with you? Do you feel like when you woke up, you had the ability to really push through in some situations, or an understanding of how to use anything like that energy in the life going forward?
Yeah, yes, but also I feel like part of my past was brought into that.
Okay.
So I feel like in that, it wasn't something that I learnt in that moment. I feel like part of that anybody that knew me before, I was quite like that anyway. So I feel like I am naturally a fighter. I'm somebody that that depiction of me is quite like I was before. And I think I remember doctors saying to me, a lot of it was also that you are incredibly strong mentally, and that you fought so hard, you fought with us. So, and they could see that medically. I mean, there was times which backs up my experience, where apparently, they had to, it's awful. I find this really hard to talk about, because they had to restrain me in the coma, which is, I mean, exactly. I can see your face. You're like, what? And anybody listening is probably like, what is she talking about? But genuinely, that's what's happened. That's what happened, because sometimes they've thought I was having fits, but I wasn't having fits. That was me fighting. So physically, that was witnessed from the outside too, which I find fascinating. Like doctors and people that were there, my mum, there was in the end, because in me fighting, I was pulling at things, they had to restrain my arms. So that is reflective of what was going on inside. And to answer your question, I feel like my past helped me fight that. I was also very physically fit at the time.
Yeah,
and
I was thinking about that actually.
The doctors said that my heart was so strong and healthy and fit that it did help a lot in terms of the medical side of it and the treatment. And then have I brought some of that fight into my life now? Absolutely, because initially it was like, well, it's my, my birthday after that was like, this is my first birthday, this is my second life. It's a funny, weird old feeling, to be honest.
I totally connect with that. I totally connect with what you're saying, because even like the birthday for me, when I was resuscitated, when I came back, that's another birthday that I have. It's almost like I have 2 birthdays a year. Like the one when I was actually physically born, but the one when I came back after being resuscitated. And it's a weird thing to think about that, but I resonate with what you're saying. Sorry, I had to jump in there with that.
No, absolutely. Because even like now, when it's that date, I try and do something on that date, or around that date, because initially it was really triggering for me, and I really struggled with that time of year. But now I try, and the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, I've been with my mom and we've done something fun, or been in a fun country, or I don't know, done something to mark it in a fun way. Whereas initially I kind of could just hide away during that period because I found it so triggering. But I want to add to the question you asked me about the fight, bringing it into my life. I think the other thing that it makes me feel is, when I'm like everybody, like I have doubts, I have, I get anxious, I get overwhelmed, like I beat myself up. But at the same time, what happened to me often helps me go, I can survive anything. Nothing could be worse than what I've survived. And you know what? It's all about experience now for me. My life is an experience. So now I'm in LA at the moment, then I can be in London, and I'm just living my life to experience my life. And that's what's so powerful, I think, about it. And that gives me a lot of strength, where I'm like, I've been in the worst place ever and fought the most horrific fight. And it wasn't just when I was in the coma. Afterwards, a lot of people don't talk about the aftermath. I mean, I struggled for so long afterwards. I had to relearn how to walk again. I couldn't, for months and months, I couldn't shower. I couldn't do anything really. And the mental battle, oh my gosh, it takes so much strength. And anybody listening that's going through illness or recovering from illness will understand. It's never, we talk so much about the moment and less about what you're having to do to try and pick up the pieces, right? So I think to even come through that and be here, and I remind myself, I have a tattoo on the back of my leg, that's a full calf of an angel, and it's an angel that has her wings wrapped around her, and she's got like a chin like tipped up, and that's significant for me for some reason, because it's not a fallen angel, she's an empowered angel. So I designed her with a tattoo artist, and the reason why I got that is, somebody said this to me the other day, the reason why I got it is because I want to remind myself what I've come through and how far I've come. And somebody said to me, well, do you need a reminder of that? And I was like, okay, point. I didn't expect that question back. And I was like, well, no, it's not that I need a reminder. It's that it helps center me and go, look at how far you've come. Look at what you've been through. There is so much strength when we, instead of running from our past and our trauma, we look and go, oh, look, I survived that. look at what I've come through and look at where I am now. And just reminding ourselves to be grateful for that. And everybody needs a reminder, you know, just because I had a near-death experience doesn't mean every day I'm like, oh, I'm so grateful for my life.
Yeah, I agree with this part as well. People feel like it's an automatic ticket to some kind of place of living, or you're automatically in a place of gratitude or understanding or something like that. But it's not like that at all. There's still the heaviness of every day, that we're still in the same world living out these lives.
Plus
there's a different perspective. Yeah, it is. It is.
Like, and you know, yeah, it's like I remember, it's really, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because a lot of people afterwards and with all the best intentions, and I'm so grateful for the support I have. And I had, because I had so much support across the board, publicly as well. I'm so grateful for people that don't even know me personally, that offered me support, and that made a difference to my life. The community on social media made a difference to my life. It made me feel, it helped me every day heal. But so many people said to me, you're so lucky. You should, I bet you're so grateful. And I'm like, well, I am, but also I don't really think I'm lucky that I nearly died.
Like,
you know,
and I think we can look.
I spent months in hospital. Like,
yeah. And I think we can look at it differently at different times and stages in our life, different emotions based on how we're feeling and what's going on in our life. Because for me, I definitely have gratitude now. But yeah, same thing when you're flat down and you can't even walk, you can't even go to the bathroom by yourself eating, you're completely reliant on others. It's quite hard to go, wow, what a gift this is. You know, I love that you've talked about the traumatic side as well, about the harder side, because it does bring it into perspective, into balance. But I think that as we go on and we become more familiar with having had this experience in our life, as we go through different things in our life, we're more able to draw on the positives or look at the benefits, or be in a different emotional space. And it isn't all up and yay. People say to me all the time as well, you're so lucky. I'm like, yeah, there's a lot that goes on behind it. You know, people write to me and they go, I wish I could have a near-death experience. And I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, hang on. The stuff that we talk about here and the public messages that are out there, they're not quite the same as going through the experience. There is a lot that goes on in the experience. So I don't know.
Yeah, you get a near-death experience because you've gone, you whatever way that is.
Yeah, usually.
It's because of trauma. That's because you've never died. So I think it's really important. You can separate the two, but they come as one. They do come as one. And that's really important to remember. And the reason why I say that is because, look, I think it's really important that to label it as it is, and to say that, yes, I've had a near-death experience and I take so much heart from what's happened to me into my life now, but acknowledging that there is day-to-day stress, that everybody feels low at times, is important to say that, because I think it's so irresponsible to say, yes, I've lived this life where I'm positive every day and I'm grateful every day, because that's just not true. And by saying that makes other people feel like, well, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
And so, yes, I've been through a near-death experience, and yes, there's a lot I took from it. Like I said, I went and got help with a lot of things that I'd ignored. I got closer in my relationships. I actually softened. This is going to make me sound so bad, but I softened in the way that I could be quite hard sometimes, because I've been through a lot. So I could be very defensive, quite protective, very headstrong. And I have an element of that still part of me, but I can recognize it a lot. And I have deeper relationships because I'm more willing to open up, and I can let myself be vulnerable, and all that comes from Rio. So in that sense, I am grateful for it, because I did a lot of healing through that, because it stripped me raw and I had no coping mechanism. I couldn't phone a friend. I couldn't go for a run. I go for a run all the time when I'm trying to cope with something or stressed. And that got
Yeah.
taken away from me. And it meant that I had to really face myself.
Mm.
And I feel that sometimes in that rawity and vulnerability and really facing yourself is how you then build yourself back up again. And what my near-death experience did to me is it showed me that. But it also, one thing I do want to make sure I say is I also didn't think about anything other than, it's almost like my world went from being so big to so small. And in that moment, nothing else mattered apart from the love I had for people and the people close to me. And I try and hold on to that a lot because I'm somebody that does get bogged down in life. I like to strive for things. I'm always pushing myself and to achieve. And I do sometimes get wrapped up in that world. I work in television and entertainment, and that comes with a particular type of mentality. But none of that mattered when I was in that situation. And I try and remember that, and I try and make sure that I really am there for my friendships and my relationships and my family, and that I'm present for them, and that they know that they're all that matters, and I don't just work all the time. And that's something that's my biggest message, I think, to myself, to be honest, because I'm sure, I don't know whether you're like it, or I'm sure some of you out there listening will relate to it, but I get bogged down in stress and work and
We all do.
Yeah. And I try and remind myself that there's always going to be something, right? There's always going to be this, that, the other. So it's just about that present and making time for people. And the other thing, it's funny talking to you is bringing all these memories back, actually. The other thing is, in that moment, I didn't have regrets either. I knew that people knew I loved them, that were close to me, and that's a nice feeling. I knew that no matter what happened, that all the people that were in my life knew that I loved them. And that's a lot of heart to take. And I think that's really important because, again, we get, we hold on to grudges, and it's not accepting people's behavior. I'm not saying that's okay, but having positive people in your life that are really there for you is important. And the other thing that happened to me is, after this happened, some of my friendships that weren't real fell away. And now I feel that I've got the people that are in my life are real and true. Whereas I feel around that time I had some people that weren't true for me and weren't really there for me, and were there in my life in a not nice and an unhealthy, let me put it, an emotionally unhealthy way. And my friends changed. I stripped back all the crap. It's probably the best way I can put it.
I really like that. And I think we have that opportunity to do that anytime. We don't need to go through a major life experience or a trauma or something like that to do that. I love how down to earth it all is for you, how you're just saying it as it is. And I can resonate with so much of what you're saying, you're feeling. And I think there's definitely some similarities going on with maybe not what we've been through, but elements of things that we've had to face. And it's been really interesting for me to listen to you and to, I don't know, draw out the little positives and draw out the bits that resonate for me. So I really appreciate your honesty, Charlie. I appreciate that you've come on here and you've shared all about it. One of my last questions for you was around how do you think this impacts you personally? What do you think you've personally learned out of it? So you just beautifully answered that question. It's more about you and your love and your time and just having no regrets, making sure that everything's okay. And we talked very early on in the conversation around how we need to be talking about death more, and we need to be talking about the hard things more. And I feel like listening to you today has really encouraged me to, I don't know, push through and really embrace this life, because it is so temporary. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what's around the corner. And there is so much that we can get out of this life. I love that you travel. I love that you're trying things, you're into things. You do kind of remind me of myself a little bit. I'm always like, let's go, let's do things, let's have experiences. And I'm like that. I like to strive for things, but I'm also learning that in the striving, we can be restful and things can flow and we can just be at peace with what's happening in the world. So Charlie Webster, thank you so much for sharing your experience, sharing everything you've learned from it, and being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And, I hope in everything that we've talked about, there is, we all have different experiences, but we're all human and we all have the same emotions. And I think the more we talk about things, the more we can see ourselves in other people and hopefully take inspiration or hope or heart from that.
Yeah, I like that. Yes, let's do that.
Yes, come on. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.